Just a minute. Okay, and then let me get back on Zoom here. Okay, so I think we are live now, and so I just want to welcome everybody. This is a little discussion study group that we do every other Wednesday, exploring one of the Pathwork Lectures. And the Pathwork Lectures were a series of 257 lectures that were channeled from 1957 to 78, and they comprise a kind of description of the soul journey and what we're here, what our purpose is, and how we sort of bring in aspects of ourself that will get us lost, or, like we actually, choose certain, things that may even wound us or bring up our challenges and our issues. But we also have a mission, to bring our gifts and to fully incarnate our own unique selves. And it's a challenging journey, this journey of life. And we don't understand often what's happening and how it is really this much deeper soul journey that we're on. So, and these lectures comprise all different kinds of subjects. So tonight we're going to be working with a lecture called Mutuality. And we usually just kind of open it up. I'm going to actually have the screen share with the lecture, and people are that are on the call, we'll have a little discussion, and I'll make some commentary and stuff as we read through it. But we will cover the material as it was received, transmitted, and these lectures are all available on pathwork.org if people want to explore this material more. So let's see, I want to bring up this lecture. To share on the screen here. Okay, here it is. Okay, I'm going to do the screen share. And hopefully, we're still able to see each other a little bit and, have the commentary. And I'm going to expand a little more. Here's somebody else that's joining us. Oh, Davis is coming in. Okay. Welcome, Davis. We're just now getting started with the lecture. So as you can see, it's called Pathwork Guide Lecture number 185, and it was originally offered and received October 9th, 1970 by the medium named Eva Paracas. And this one is titled Mutuality, a Cosmic Principle and Law. So greetings, my friends, blessings and love for every one of you. The topic of tonight's lecture is mutuality. Mutuality is a cosmic principle and law. I will divide this subject into 3 sections. The first deals with mutuality as a cosmic principle. The second deals with how this law manifests in human life. And the third deals with the nature and origin of the hindrances which disturb the law of mutuality. So mutuality is a cosmic or spiritual law. No creation can take place unless mutuality exists. Mutuality means that two apparently or superficially different entities or aspects move toward one another and cooperate with and affect one another to create a new divine manifestation. New forms of self-expression can only come into being when the self merges with something beyond itself. Mutuality is the movement that bridges the gap between duality and unity, between separation and, interconnectedness. And whenever there is separation, mutuality must come into being in order to eliminate this separation. Nothing can be created unless mutuality exists, be it a new galaxy, a work of art, or a good relationship between human beings. This applies even to the creation of the simplest object. To illustrate this principle, let's take this example. First, the idea of the object must be formed in the mind. Without the creative inspiration and imagination by which the mind extends itself beyond its previous awareness of what already exists, not even a plan can be formed. This creative aspect must then cooperate with the second aspect of mutuality, namely execution, which implies labor, effort, perseverance, and self-discipline. Unless the creative idea and all those activities which are more mechanical and ego-determined work together in harmony, the object cannot be created. The first aspect, creative thinking and inspiration, can never complete creation unless the second aspect of execution is brought to bear on the venture. This applies without exception to everything. Whether you create an object, compose a symphony, paint a picture, write a novel, cook a meal, search for new scientific discoveries, heal illness, create mutual love, develop on the path of self-realization. This law of mutuality applies to all endeavors, all successful completion, and all meaningful self-expression. So, I was also just working with a lecture on communication, and sort of the great effort that it requires to have clear communication. And yet, it's like that's a part of sort of this active aspect of mutuality, and we have to work at it sometimes. And I find myself often with, the creative inspiration, but then, trying to express it or, help people understand what I'm thinking or whatever that seems like. And so I think we also have strengths, and maybe some people are really, good with, like sort of the grounding of things and the execution of things. But it does require, somehow whatever is, made manifest this, both aspects. So any comments or questions on that part? Okay, so continuing, such a synthesis of creativity, imagination, and ideas on the one hand, and execution on the other, must come about, even though these processes and attitudes appear to be quite alien to each other. The creative attitude is a free-flowing, spontaneous manifestation. It's like I often find that, it's like creative thoughts just kind of pop in my mind the minute I'm not, busy doing something else, right? Or, some sense of, getting present to something, and it stimulates or, inspires something in me, just being, open to it. So there's this, real, I think inspiration, even the word, it's like it's a breathing in. It's like this way that we are enthusiastic, and excited about what we're doing. And I think that word enthusiasm, kind of is this like God-inspired words too, filled with, and theos, I think, is filled with God, right? So there's this, expanded, free-flowing, spontaneous manifestation. And then the execution is an act that comes through the determination of the ego will. It is more mechanical and laborious, requiring consistency and effort. it has totally different characteristics from the spontaneous, effortless influx of creative ideas. Human beings are uncreative for two reasons. Either they are unwilling to adopt the necessary self-discipline to follow through on their creative ideas. And that, is not just a fault, or a judgment against you. It's like even those that have that kind of sense, of a block to that capacity to execute. There's reasons for that, and that's what I like about the pathwork is that, it kind of always takes us deeper into self-understanding, self-awareness, and takes us out of this realm of just self-judgment or, sort of the cultural lens of success and failure or good and bad kinds of things. So, this other totally different, process, that's, uh, we can be unwilling to, have that follow through and that self discipline and that sort of structuring of our creativity. Um, or so other people, and it can also, we can each have some of each, are emotionally and spiritually so contracted, that we can't open to the creative channels. Like there's, sort of a kind of inner, um, focus maybe on the doing, and the person is not so comfortable in that realm of expansion and being and or is working with this other process, which, like we also have phases of our lives, right? Because there's this kind of movement through life. What's really interesting now, as I was reading this, I was realizing that, we're right in this time. I think February 20th, so about a month from now, is like the actual like perfect conjunction. But we've been in sort of this dance and this movement of these two planets that represent exactly what we're talking about. Neptune, which is this expansive, boundaryless, inspirational, creative, oceanic kind of flowing planet, right? That I think is this one aspect. And then Saturn has always been known for, its like structure, right? And it's grounding things and, functioning, making things work and everything. And so they're both coming into this alignment, a conjunction, right at the very initial beginning sign of the whole zodiac. So 0 degrees Aries is like, this, you know, like the death is, at the end of Pisces, and then 0 degrees Aries is the rebirth. And that's this new life force that, has this, I think Aries is this energy of, this new life that just breaks through stone, even though it's a tender shoot of grass, somehow it, manifests and breaks through. And so, I think in a way that these two planets symbolizing, these very energies that are part of this mutuality coming together, right at this new, creative degree of Aries that's saying, okay, it's time for a new whole paradigm or a new, creation coming. And so, again, having these planets together, is this example of this mutuality. And so it might be a powerful omen. It also, Neptune in its, kind of like all of the planets, just like everything in the pathwork, it can have this divinity and distortion, right? And so the distorted aspect of Neptune can be, kind of delusional aspect. It's like it's so open and ungrounded, it's delusional. And of course, the distortion in Saturn can be a kind of rigidity and a kind of inflexibility that makes things, very stuck. So I don't know. I just thought that was interesting that that's sort of happening in the skies right now, and sort of, I think, harboring this potential of a new reset, a new mutuality that might be coming into the planet of these, really finding a new inspired creative, spiritual. Neptune is also a very spiritual planet, way of being on the planet and grounding that in structure and government and the systems that we need to support ourselves. Now, these are very slow moving planets, and so it's probably not going to happen overnight, but hopefully that can be a you know good sign for us. Okay, where was I? So let me just back up. Maybe I've read this before, but I'll start here. So execution is this act of that comes through the determination of the ego will, and it is more mechanical and laborious, requiring consistency and effort. It has totally different characteristics from the spontaneous, effortless influx of creative ideas. Human beings are uncreative for two reasons. Oh yeah, well, I remember we were right in this. So we got to the one. I think we covered them both, but let me go over them again. So they're either unwilling to adopt the self-discipline to follow through on their creative ideas, or they are some sort of emotionally and spiritually too contracted to stop to open their own individual creative channels, into this flow and this influx. So in the first case, they refuse to be bothered by the difficulties, the trials and errors, right? It's like uh, because that in a way, it's like it's part of, I think, what the earth plane brings to us, and the guide even says, when we come here, we're easily frustrated by the fact that it takes so much effort and repeat and stuff like that to get something to stick in matter, because we're kind of used to just being able to think it and it's there or something, and so this like very slow work in the material realm, I think, is hard in some ways for the spirit, and the child is closer to its experience as spirit, and so this is a kind of yoke, or sometimes a place where frustration comes in. I know for my ADHD child, it was my mother loved folding things and making them neat in her drawers and things like that, but it wasn't my favorite thing at all. So, there's this, you know, way that I think, that as children we are more connected to that creative, inspirational, and spontaneous flow, right? And so we really do have to be supported in learning, sort of the effort and the stick to itiveness, and when we easily get frustrated, it's like we can be difficult um, in this. So, it's just a beautiful way of, again, seeing this balancing that has to go on in the universe, in all of these different levels. So, let's see. Let me go ahead and go to the next page. So both of these lopsided attitudes, like the distortions of these things, gradually balance themselves out when individuals grow on the path, right? So we come in and we discover balance by, discovering imbalance, and then we're also, taught that a lot of this imbalance is also coming from our internal conflicts, and so we begin to also look deep into our own inner dynamics, and this is also, I think, a part of the winter months, this sort of uh, inner self-seeking and introspection, and time of pause and quiet as well. Hopefully people are you know in the midst of all of the challenges sometimes of winter, like allowing themselves to, have some hibernation time. We're expecting a big snowstorm, so hopefully we can be ready for that and just, settle in and let that natural event, take us into a time of inner calm and rest and renewal, right? So deep like the seed in the ground to kind of recharge ourselves. And if we can follow in the flow of what's out there, I think that's an aspect of mutuality as well. It's like we're responding in a mutual way to what life brings, right? And it's not always easy. I resist that a lot, but it's a part of sort of, I think, the practices that we're in. And I always find that when I can, really just, flow with what is, that it works out generally to the best than when my active outer will is trying to make something happen that is not naturally happening. So, healthy, balanced people who have found themselves always find their personal creative outlets that yield the deepest satisfaction. An imbalance of these two aspects of creation, in particular, striking in the area of human relationships. I must have read that wrong, but anyway, it's about how these kinds of things also are affecting the human relationships. So the creative, spontaneous, effortless experience that initially brings two people together in attraction and love occurs all the time. And yet this connection is rarely maintained, and all sorts of explanations are given for this. And yet what mostly happens is that the labor of working out the inner dissensions is neglected. The childish idea prevails that once the initial act has taken place, the self is powerless to determine the course of the relationship. Usually the relationship is treated as if it were a separate entity that either favorably or unfavorably runs its own course. So we shall discuss this misconception further in the section of our talk. The whole universe consists of the harmonious mutual interplay between effortless creative imagination and execution, which always requires labor, investment, commitments, and self-discipline. The bridge of mutuality is a very important aspect of unity and creation. Mutuality is not the same as the unified principle itself, which is opposed to the dualistic principle. The difference between the unified principle and the principle of mutuality is that the latter leads to unification and is actually the movement toward it. And it is not yet unification itself. So the mutuality is like the potentiality and the movement that allows the unification to happen. For mutuality to operate, there must be an expansive reciprocal movement toward another attitude, aspect, or person. Two expansive movements must flow out toward one another in a harmonious interplay of giving and receiving, of mutual cooperation, of positive opening. This means that, in fact, two yes currents must move toward each other. The ability to accept, bear, and sustain pleasure can be increased in human beings only gradually. It is one of the most difficult goals to obtain. This ability depends directly on a person's integration and wholeness. So hence, mutuality depends on the entity's ability to say yes when a yes is offered, right? And, we all also, have some difficulty with that. Again, it's a kind of universal way that, we're all struggling and have our own unique versions of this, right? But I think it's really important and beautiful what he's saying there. I don't know if you can sense that, but I love the way of describing mutuality is it's like this ability to, say yes to somebody else's yes, right? To or something else's yes, some doesn't have to be another person. Like again, he says it's, doesn't matter if it's, uh, like an individual or an aspect or an event or something like that. But there's this, two movements flowing out toward one another in a harmonious interplay of giving and receiving, of mutual cooperation, of positive opening. And, this is really what we long for. It's like it's what we are so often disappointed of. We keep trying, and it feels like we keep failing to achieve, in our relationships with one another, right? And there are many reasons behind that. And again, not to get discouraged. It's like there's a sort of way that we have to just keep, giving it another attempt and trying to understand where maybe, we have our images or our defenses or whatever that, is making our attempts, also, you know, reflecting back something to us, right? But we can also find in our own selves, our own resistance. I mean, it makes so much sense, like, well, I don't want to say yes to the other guy until they say yes to me first. And if it's been in a long-term, relationship or whatever, sometimes, it's, very, there's a lot of distrust. There's a lot of, sort of old water under the bridge. And so, to really find that space honestly within, of a yes current that can move, even if, like the other one can offer it, and that may not be the case either, right? So a lot of, I think, couples work and stuff is working through, sort of the old, disconnects along those lines, and where, you know, the inner being has to say no, and you can't kind of override that, because otherwise that would be a mask, or, so the person has to work with that inner no current, and understand it. And then, again, not all no currents are wrong, but you can't have a mutuality if there's a no current. So, any questions or comments here? Does this, do you recognize this in, in your own, creations? Again, it doesn't have to be relationship kinds of things. It can be in your creative endeavors, like, and, having a mutuality, where you say yes to something, and are willing to maybe make the efforts towards it, right? Frank, I don't know, I'm thinking with you, with your music, and the mutuality that it takes, for people to receive your playing, and, your, your desire to share and offer that, is like dependent on their yes to receiving it. I'm assuming, I know that's the case, for me a lot, so does that relate to you and your creative
I
mind?
would say recently it's more about me wanting to offer it. In fact, on New Year's Day, I went to a party and I did bring my guitar, which I have done, several times. I'll bring my guitar to a party, and a lot of times I'll never comes out of the case. But at this party, one of the people there grabbed my guitar and literally shoved it in my face and said, "Play us some songs." So yeah, it was kind of like they were saying, "Come on, that was their yes. Their yes was, come on, give us your, give us something. Yeah, lately I have just been stuck on that, stuck on not being able to release my
Uh-huh.
gift, so to speak.
Well, maybe hopefully that was a good new catalyst or something. And
It
you
worked out
know,
great. I mean, it really, once I got going, I really got going. So it worked
yeah,
out
yeah,
great,
yeah.
you know?
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, there's a, like in the human design stuff, there's this one kind of human design that, like sort of, and I think that this is maybe true of everybody, but to some degree, right? But it's really like sort of a, you know, y- if we're trying to get that attention rather than, that attention saying yes to, like if, we're trying to, get them to want to, us to perform or whatever, or just play and sing, or just,
Yeah.
do
Well, I
do
mean,
something, offer something creative. Yeah, it doesn't. We need to be invited.
I'm
Um,
not an attention seeking kind of personality.
yeah,
I
yeah,
have to be prodded, so to
right,
speak.
right.
Um,
And
and
then do you find that, when people though are, saying yes or wanting, you to come out, that, like you really blossom and maybe even feel more brilliant than normal,
true.
and I think this is a kind of exchange of energy that happens in that mutuality, it's like a
Yeah.
part of, like and it in a relationship it can be that mutuality of eros, of falling in love, of being attracted to each other and sort of bringing out the best in each other and that kind of stuff. But yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else, like recognize this in their kind of sense of bringing out their own creativity, and like maybe you can say yes if others are saying yes, but you also have trouble kind of announcing, that you would like to do something like that. It needs to be invited from you.
I would say that I could look back and look at times in my life where I was very creative. But I don't think there's one, maybe I'm just waiting to see what pushes its way through, because
Yeah, it's like creativity is really way vaster than sort of the one soul journey and the one personality and stuff like that. But it's like the experience of incarnation sort of limits us from this larger aspect of our being. And so sometimes I think, like it seems like it's over or we're done, but I have a sense if we're still here somehow, that the soul would not agree with that, right? It's like that there's more, and we just don't, it's in the unconscious. We just haven't, you know, uh, understood or yet found that inspiration within us again. But I understand. Yeah, it's like when it feels like that moment is past. And in some ways, it's like Frank and I are kind of getting up there in years. Our moments have passed too. It's like there are these times that just are also a part of the medicine wheel. And so it's not to avoid acknowledging the poignancy, the real feelings that we have when we're we feel sort of the creative, you know, purposes that we had somehow are no longer available to us. And that's a deep loss and a kind of journey, I think that hopefully, they'll be through and out the other side at some point, because I do think, we have more, and, it's an amazing thing, how, like if you look at the creativity of the universe, and even we're still like totally puzzled and don't understand our whole model of sort of the way the universe has evolved, has gotten rocked a little bit lately. But it's like the one thing that continues, it seems, is that it's like there it keeps creating new things, right? It keeps complexifying and creating new things and developing n- new amazing wonders. And so I think if it's full of anything, it's full of surprises. And it's kind of like that's a part of, in the the midst of sort of this time on earth where I'm there's a lot of beings that are suffering because of because of us. um and maybe climate change would happen, or all of this would happen anyway, earth changes and everything, but everything is shaking. And so it just feels like um, it- this is like maybe the ending of something, but it's also just like on the medicine wheel, just like in the, cosmic medicine wheel of zodiac, it's like it's an ending and it's a new beginning at the same time. And so I guess my sense is like, yeah, it's really a deep time of creativity. And it's a time calling forth all of our creativity as much as possible to find our way into a different kind of future. And I believe that each of us have has a unique way of doing that we came here to un- uncover. And maybe we've already done it, or maybe we're doing it, or I mean, it doesn't, having children, doing all of your music up until now, Frank, but it's kind of like I think it's there's still room for us to offer more and to find
Well,
even.
Darlene, I play music every day for myself,
Yeah.
and and in a spontaneous, mostly in a spontaneous way. And like when it comes to the act of creativity, I mean, there's a split second between the thought and the creation when you're spontaneously, sitting down with your guitar and just riffing, you know.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know where that fits into the mutuality equation, but I do it every day.
Okay.
It's just that when it comes to performing, I need to be prodded
Right. And
to
so that would
perform.
be and maybe you don't want to perform, so that's also fine, but that's where there's, it's like the sharing of that, and maybe, it's like it's a comfort for you, and you receive it, but there may be in the unconscious, like a longing more to like going to that party and stuff like that, and a mutuality of giving and receiving. If you can do more of that, and then you have your inner no, to that for various reasons. I'm the same way. So, and we can only do so much, and all of that. Maybe the music circuit or whatever, however way it would be, but it is a kind of like a study, and again, maybe it's not through your music that way you've done it. Maybe there's something else or something new, or maybe it's simply now, taking care of yourself
Mm,
and relationships. And, it's like it's not, there's no creativity is, to me, it's like we are creating our lives.
yeah. I do think there is a bit of a taking care of yourself element to the equation. Like, I mean, I'm sure there are times when you just sit down, pick up your guitar and, play a song for yourself. No one else is in the room, no one else is around, but so it's like a taking care of yourself moment in a way.
Yeah, and there's a mutuality there, and I find, it's a spiritual practice, so I usually am feeling, connected in some way,
Yeah.
to my longing, to my prayer, to my voice, and yeah,
The
it's
birds
what.
and the bees might be hearing you.
Right. I mean, the birds often join with me, or I
Yeah.
play my harmonica for the frogs, so yeah. Yeah, it doesn't have to be, a human thing, and just to be inspired, is beautiful, and so I'm not saying it's a one way or another, or even, that there's any shoulds behind it, but there is this kind of, deep listening that we can do inside of us, around, what is the call, at this point, moment to moment, to bring forth our gifts, try to learn something new, to expand creative potential. I mean, there's so much more on the guitar I could do, and I haven't set aside the time or the practice or anything like that. So, there's that part for me, of the structure and the follow through, and that's the harder part. So, um, and yet, there is a mutuality to that. Like I find, like I will give and commit to something more like that when I know others are with me, and we're doing it in a group or something, So like if I, for instance, using the musical thing too, I'd love to have, uh, more voices and a little more, music on my recordings, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a professional thing, but, I even got one of those programs, but I don't know if I'll ever figure out how to use it. But, it's kind of like I would love to have a group of people that want to learn my hymns and sing, and make a recording of all of them, that might be a little more rich than, what I can do by myself. And there's something about, again, this richness of these mutual creations, but they are also much more fraught, much more hard to, kind of magnetize to you, to get to happen. It's kind of like having a class, a TP class form. It's almost like you have to have this kind of magnetism that draws people to this kind of mutuality and people's willingness to say yes to that kind of experience and that kind of investment, that kind of, you know, involvement with each other. And, you know, it's a rarity, and also people are very stressed and strained and trying to just deal with their families and their immediate situations and a lot of, like lives and stuff. So, there's I keep thinking back, when I grew up, you know, my mother was a full-time housewife, and my father made enough money for, to send three kids to college and, have a good life, But now, both everybody has to, be making money, or, there's not enough time for, if you've got a good job, you're kind of married to the job, and you're, like it's all that you're invested in. So there's a lot of different imbalances out there in these things, right? And I think some of it is, part of why we're kind of wobbly and shaky. Um, but yeah, so these are all good examples and ways of thinking about this that hopefully can help us understand a little more what the guide is referring to. And then he goes on more into, sort of our resistance, right? That to some degree all human beings are afraid of opening up. And at the beginning of doing this inner work, we may not suspect that we have this resistance or fear in us. And if we did suspect it, we may have explained it away. Maybe we were, too ashamed to admit it, so we're just denying it, or maybe we, you know, have an explanation. So we erroneously thought that there was something wrong with ourselves, something that no other valuable human being shared. And therefore, no one must be allowed to suspect this flaw in us. But as you went on, you learned to fully admit, accept, and properly understand the universality of this problem of yours. So it wasn't, just, something wrong with you. It was not taken personally to the degree that originally it is. And so after diligent work, many of you are now able to acknowledge your fear of opening up and expanding. And you may at times be quite aware of this fear and see how you hold back your energy, your feelings, your vital forces, because you believe yourself to be safer through the control you exert when you are contracted. Right? So I think we all recognize that, like the body kind of tries to exert this control through the contraction of the musculature, and then we feel it internally, as a contracted, blocked, tense state, right? Sometimes, we feel the agitation where we can't control it, right? And we don't like that. So, we're also usually tensing around that. And to the degree that, this contraction uh, holds true, then we're gonna, if we're that's that's the no current, right? So we're gonna have problems with mutuality. If mutuality is a you know, two mutual yes currents coming together, like either side having even the slightest no current will impact that. So people who are least developed and most alienated from their inner truth will deny any kind of expansion and therefore any mutuality. However, this does not mean that their longing for it is eliminated. The longing is always there. Yet it is also true that entities manage to squelch the longing for expansion and mutuality, perhaps through entire incarnations without becoming aware of the feeling that so much is lacking in their lives. And so, I don't know, like you can see this in the world, some, contending ourselves with the pseudo security of the separateness and aloneness, because this offers less threat, and I think in this world right now it's true for all of us, and I think it's probably not to be judged. There's this movement that we're all going through, and again, this uh, sense of isolation, of separateness and aloneness is a kind of universal experience now from different sides and different reasons, and like lots of stuff's kind of just surfacing. And I think that this is, like something to explore, something to, understand, but to integrate, to notice and like really acknowledge in ourselves and not try to, make it a problem, right? It's like, and to see what happens if we can just, understand more deeply what's happening that, makes that security of separateness and aloneness feel so desirable right now. And of course, we can look around and understand some of that. It feels like the world is a kind of crazy, dangerous place right now, and there's a lot of, people that seem, different than us, or, just in masks, or, there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of, one-upmanship and, putting people down, and all of these things, right, make us naturally, I think, want to pull back. However, when development proceeds a little more, even in the natural pulling back, the longing becomes stronger and more conscious. And there are many degrees and many alternatives. But speaking in an oversimplified way for the sake of clarity, those people who are in the second stage are the ones who are willing to open up, but are still afraid of doing so when an opportunity arises for actual mutuality. So, it's like we get to a place where, the longing and the desire, for that kind of experience overcomes the fear, or we risk in certain ways, maybe trying to take intelligent risks, or trying to, and the guide is also teaching us how a lot of what we're receiving, like if we reach out in mutuality and get rejected or something like that, that also is coming from sort of our deeper unconscious processes. And as we begin to integrate and heal, inside that, we will learn to communicate. We will learn, how to risk reaching out more, and, to bring ourselves forward. And we will also have a kind of base in ourselves that, like we risk, and maybe somebody doesn't get it, or somebody doesn't, even puts it down or doesn't see it, and we don't take it as hard as we used to, because we have our own self, connection and self understanding and self acknowledgement and validation. So we kind of know what we're about. We know that it's a good thing, that we're giving it our best, and then if it doesn't work, okay, like, well, maybe back to the drawing board, but there's no like recrimination. There's no, it's like, okay, let's learn more, right? Is really the only response to those kinds of failures. And it's not, all our fault, of course, but it's kind of like, well, you know, the more that we can understand cause and effect, then the more that we might be able to, learn this beauty of this mutuality and this kind of dancing with life, with ourselves, with each other, all of that. So, comments, questions? So, he's going here a little bit into sort of the fantasy issues, which I mentioned before, again, even with Neptune, are kind of like some of the risk. So let me see. However, when development proceeds a little more, the longing becomes stronger and more conscious, and there are many degrees and many alternatives. But speaking in an oversimplified way for the sake of clarity, those people who are at the second stage, who are the ones willing to open up, but are still afraid of doing so when an opportunity arises for actual mutuality. The only way the bliss and pleasure of expansion and union can be experienced for people at this stage is in fantasy. This leads to a very common and frequent fluctuation. Such people are convinced that their strong longing indicates their actual readiness for real mutuality. After all, they experience it so beautifully in their fantasies. And I think even, sort of like, the Trump phenomenon, for instance, there's a lot of people that, see him through the eyes of expansion, and, like they're seeing certain ways that they understand him, to be an answer, and I think it's a fantasy in some ways, and that they're not going to, you know, end up with what they're expecting. But that will remain to be seen, and also, it's a kind of way that, even, like mass movements can kind of, I guess, act as false flags of this kind of mutuality, right? And be a negative form of it, and again, people feel belonging, they feel identified with all of that good stuff, that might come with real mutuality and real creativity. But, it's another thing, more like a cult kind of identification. So he's saying basically, though, that, some people, might really have a strong longing and feel they're ready for a real mutuality. But, we can always know the truth, if we're conscious in our own being. And again, it's not to try to push ourselves through anything. We have to wait until we can find our inner yes inside. So, but he's continuing, he says, after all, they experience this, beautiful relationship, this possible, way of being with other people, in a beautiful way in their fantasies. And they still do not experience it in reality, is ascribed to lack of luck in meeting the right partner. When the partner finally appears, the old fear is still rampant, the soul movements contract, and the fantasy cannot be realized. And this doesn't have to even be a mate partner or that kind of thing. It's like, this can happen in friendship, or, all kinds of different ways. As there's, where there's more dependency on the other person, right? Then there's going to be fear. So again, this is this answer to, strengthening our own self within, and our inner relationship with ourself. The soul movements contract, and then, fantasy or even the reality couldn't be realized. So this is, like I said, explained away. Let's see, let me jump forward here. Yet this does Yet does this very fact not indicate that some deeper force must be at work in the person's psyche that makes sure to attract the partner with whom the contraction appears justified? So, he's saying again that there's these very subtle ways that we are in our soul journey, like like the parts that we think are the problem are actually part of the awakening aspect of the journey. So where we get lost or stuck in life, looking back on all of my times, like I see, from hindsight, oh, that's was also part of waking up, right? So, um, it seems that, when we are, looking at it through the keyhole of time, just, more recently, that it's hard to see. And, the contraction appears justified and the problem is real. And, you know, like he's saying that for the deeper self always knows where a person stands. So, we are reading the other person as well. And maybe we are reading that there is willingness that's still lacking, both in more in the other person than our own self, maybe, or maybe both of us. And so, we're, seeing that, that we don't want to face the deeper issue, and true subterfuges and excuses are very necessary for the preservation of the ego. But failure in the relationship always indicates that the self is not yet ready to put true mutuality into practice. Many people continue to go alternately through periods of aloneness and acute longing, and then temporary fulfillment of a sort in which either outer or inner obstructions prevent mutuality. The consequent disappointment may lend even more justification to unconscious fears, which feed the determination not to open up and be carried by the stream of life. The pain and the confusion are often very profound in people trapped at this stage, but this pain and confusion will eventually lead to the full commitment to recognize the real inner source of this fluctuation. The meaning of this stage is rarely understood. The pain and confusion are there because the fluctuation's true significance is not recognized. When a growing person comes to see that periods of aloneness afford him or her some opportunity to open up in comparative safety, and to experience, even though vicariously, some manner of fulfillment without taking the necessary steps, he or she has indeed made a substantial step towards self-realization necessary. So it's like, I think he's just saying, it's like, that we have to do it, sometimes be in aloneness and develop, an inner foundation. Concomitantly, when he or she recognizes the true underlying significance of the difficulties encountered during the times of tentative relationship, the same holds true. Alternating periods of aloneness and relating have their own built-in safety valves. Each preserves the self in its separate state and simultaneously helps it venture out to the extent the entity has become ready to come out of separation. But at one point on the road of individual evolution, everyone comes to recognize fully how painful this fluctuation is, which subsequently leads to a commitment to be open to mutuality and fulfillment, to interplay and expansion, to cooperation and positive pleasure. This always requires relinquishing the negative pleasure and the pseudo-safety. The soul then becomes ready to learn, experiment, risk, mutuality, love, pleasure, and to function safely in an open state. At the third stage are the people relatively capable of sustaining actual mutuality, not in fantasy, not in longing only, but in an as-if situation. Needless to say that all steady relationships on this earth do not indicate real mutuality. In fact, very, very few do. Most relationships are formed with other motives, or else the original motivation of mutuality was given up when it could not be maintained, and other motives replaced it. These are basically the three stages humanity goes through with respect to mutuality. Of course, these stages cannot be differentiated in such exact terms. They often overlap, fluctuate, and interchange. Many, many degrees exist and hold true for each of the various levels of the personality. And some parts of our personality are, capable of more mutuality than others. What may be true on one level for a specific person may not be true on another. Now let us come to the third and perhaps most important part of this lecture. What are the obstacles prohibiting mutuality between two human beings? Usually this is explained, and quite accurately in part, by the problems human beings have. Yet this does not really say enough. Mutuality can exist only to the degree that the individuals involved know about and are in contact with the evil of their previously hidden destructive side. Conversely, if there is a rift between conscious striving for goodness, love, and decency, and the unconscious bent on destructiveness, hate, and negation, mutuality cannot take place. I emphasize here that mutuality is not absent because the evil aspects are still there, but because awareness of them is lacking. This is an all-important distinction. Usually human beings approach this problem in precisely the opposite way. They believe they must first eradicate the still existing evil, for otherwise they are undeserving of the bliss that comes from mutuality. The evil is too frightening to be acknowledged, so that the rift between the conscious awareness of the self and the unconscious denial of self widens as life goes on. If you are alienated from your own unconscious, you must act out what deep in yourself you know exists within you. You act it out with another person and affect a similarly unconscious and concealed level of that other person. Unless this key is applied, relationships must falter or become stale, and mutuality in the true sense cannot unfold. Therefore, it is crucial for you to gain increasing contact with the unconscious destructive aspects of your being. We have had precisely this aim ever since we started working on this path, and yet how difficult it seems. It's for the individual to bridge the gap between the conscious good and the unconscious evil. How much struggle everyone puts up, and how many people are tempted to leave the pursuit altogether because it seems too painful and difficult to accept previously unacceptable aspects of themselves. Yet life cannot be truly lived unless this happens. Your inner split must reappear as a split between you and others, unless you are fully conscious of your own self. So I don't know if this makes sense to everybody here, and it's not, to be forced, but I think sometimes we can see like how, like the other person that's being the way they are sort of also reflects some aspect of the way we are towards ourselves. And, that doesn't have to be the case, but it's always useful to see that, right? And to look for, the kind of way that, these things are also familiar, in our journey, like kind of co-create, repetitive creations. Because in this way, it's like there is some kind of unconscious creation, and that's what we're suffering and struggling with. And we deeply long to find freedom and release and healing, but it's kind of like we have to be able to, see and look deep inside and love ourselves and, feel safe within our own being to do that. And if we have parts of our own being that, are too harsh with us, or, like are, sort of like these parts that I don't know, like maybe, confront us in a way that, makes us feel bad. I think these are parts that are not really, we may think, that we deserve them, or something about them seems true, but I think these are, generally parts that are able to kind of come in and take possession of the energy of our longing, of our desire to be good, of our, of our unclarity of, I know maybe one of the questions I came into this incarnation with was, well, how good do you have to be, and how long do you have to pay for your badness? It was like, this kind of feeling that, there was some judge outside of me, right? That was one, and of course inside of myself I wanted to be good, but that was like a child that went to Sunday school and heard about Jesus and how loving he was, and that he just wanted us to love and kind, and that made total sense to the child. I wanted to do that, but then there were a lot of times as a child that I wasn't feeling loving. I was mad, I was you know uh, frustrated, and I was kind of so the child that longs to be good, and then has all of these other aspects of humanity there. Somehow we didn't have the adults there that could help us understand that, yeah, we have good and bad, and that it's not, like we chose to bring that in, and that's not a bad thing, and we're working with it, and that's not a bad thing, and so it's really all good. And that this part that fears our badness and our unworthiness, right, is an maybe even an old past life, or an old confusion from the fall, like some deep fear that we're not the light that we are, right? And that we have love in us, we have light in us, and our imperfections really do not take that out of us. I mean, as a maybe parents, or the people that you love, they're not perfect, but their imperfections don't make you not love them anymore. And so there's, I think, this aspect of understanding divine love, and our own worthiness to be a part of this universal whole, of this great evolutionary journey, however you want to understand it, the part of the movement of our times, that we are worthy. And to have that deep feeling inside, is, I think, a part of what can allow us to say yes. And otherwise we're always a little tentative, we're always a little not sure. So I don't know if that makes any sense. I kind of riffed off there, but I think there's an important kind of mutuality within ourselves that is part of what is the foundation of finding that more expansive willingness to say yes to the world. So back up a little. So life is difficult, when we're in our inner split. And he says, your inner split must reappear as a split between you and others unless you're fully conscious of your own self. And then becoming conscious is to begin mending the rift. Consciousness diminishes the rift. Consciousness must eventually lead to the acceptance of what was previously denied. If there is no mutuality between you and all the aspects of yourself, because your standards, your demands, and your expectations of yourself are unrealistic, it is absolutely unthinkable that mutuality between you and others can ever exist. So again, like we have to find this way of, accepting ourselves as we are, and knowing that, we have worth and value, even though we are imperfect and, still evolving.
Darlene, I have a question about the split. Um, does it sound sort of like this, maybe in a subconscious or unconscious way? It would sound like maybe if I am not perfect, I don't deserve to be loved. Therefore, if you are not perfect, you don't deserve my love. Does that sound like?
Yeah, Yeah, exactly. You can, and I think also, like you can also, project, okay, I don't deserve love, so the other person, is gonna be not loving towards us, right?
That,
So we
yeah.
might project out also, like sort of a negation of ourselves that comes from our expectation that that's all we deserve.
But we do find, I mean, we do find the capacity to love people who are not perfect. Um, I think we only feel mostly that way about ourselves. We feel like if I'm not perfect, I don't deserve to be loved. But we do, I believe, have a lot of capacity to love people who we know are not perfect, you
And I
know?
think I use that as a part of a way of, questioning myself, in this journey of healing, because when I became aware of that fact, I realized the logical inconsistency of it, it's like, okay, so if I can love other people that aren't perfect, what's going on with
With
this?
myself.
Yeah, this, and I think there's a kind of pride there, and there's a kind of, I don't know, like many levels of that we can work. But again, it's not even in judging that. It's like if we name it pride and then go to war with it, that's not going to integrate it. We have to like understand. Well, what is pride? Well, it's like the defense against shame, and I you know have that wound there, and have found that way to try to help it, but then we can begin to see how it's not helping, and our self-judgment is harming us, or making it even worse. And so again, I think this a deep journey in a sense, and a big question of how can we get ourselves to open our hearts to ourselves, right? We can
Yeah,
open our
and where did the idea come from to begin with that we need to be perfect?
Exactly. I mean, even in in the Bible, there's this place where they quote Jesus a lot of saying, "Be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." But I actually read that that was a mistranslation, and the actual correct translation of the word "perfect" in that situation is "be ye whole as your Father in heaven is whole." Right? So that creates a whole different kind of way of looking at it too. That's an integrative way instead of this separating, resisting, rejecting, dividing thing. And whenever we have this perfection or this, like how we should be, and we fall short of it, then we merge with our failing self, and then whenever we're trying to, you know, keep ourselves from failing, we're, kind of forcing ourselves into this resistant kind of demanding, self that, so that it's yeah, it's a really good inner study to keep exploring this inner split. And the guide is saying it's only where we have inner splits that we have neurosis, and essentially, the healing of our outer world begins with this healing of this inner, these inner fractures and fractionations.
Yeah, this topic of the inner split has come up before, and it is a bit. I mean, if I've been told that it's like a key to understanding your personal struggle. If you could define your personal split, if you could come up with the lines that say, uh, um, if I am this, I'm I'm screwed. And if I am not this, I am also screwed.
Right,
Basically,
right, right. You can
you
see that.
know?
Right, right. The guide says where we have these kind of experiences, and yeah, we don't always have them conscious. It's like we're sort of there's a long, slow death and a short, quick death.
Yeah,
A way, no matter which way we go, it's sort of a damned if we do, damned if we don't.
right.
And we've been sort of habitually taking the long, slow death, thinking that we're avoiding the worst death, But if we really examine it deeper, we can see, that the long, slow death is just as painful, and the short, quick death maybe not what we're so afraid of. So this is part of what the short, quick death is always, is to just feel the hurt, right?
Yeah.
And let the movement of the like holding ourselves. So, but we can't feel that hurt, and this is where the original soul split is when we do not have compassion for ourselves, and we are not turning towards ourselves saying, oh, I see you, I acknowledge you, I hold you, I understand you. And this is what that child needed in the beginning, that it didn't get, that created the trauma. It wasn't the experience that was traumatizing, it was that there was nobody there to hold that child in that state and say that everything is okay and it's not their fault, and like all of that. And so when we go into the re-traumatizing, we go into usually our own self-hatred, our own self-punishment, our own self-judgment, and we perpetuate sort of this hostile attitude towards the inner child that simply is looking for love. And the only place it can receive the love that it needs right now is from ourselves, in a very, very, concrete kind of way.
Mhm.
Again, I like this focusing for doing some of that. So, but, it's like, that's what we're trying to do first. Is, to me, when it says self-split, I mean, there's many kinds of ways, and what you said is that, but sort of there's this initial one that is my rejection of who I am,
Mm.
my unhappiness with myself,
Mm.
you know.
And when you're an adult, all the love that anybody else could give you is not going to fix that. It helps a lot, I believe, when you're young. It's like, okay, you're having trouble with yourself when you're young, and your parents, are give you some loving support. I think that it helps then. But when you're older and you're an adult at the
It has to
same
come
time,
from us. I mean, the
yeah,
guide basically says that, he says that, as a child, we needed our parents to reflect back our unique and beauty and our greatness
right.
and all of that. And when we didn't get it, it was really a loss, and we have a big hole in our soul. And yet, that it's not the end of the world. It does begin a descent and a journey into the underworld, and like, but that is also a part of what awakens our compassion for others, our you know uh a whole soul journey, in a sense. And where we want to end up is coming back and recognizing, the guide says, our identification, instead of from the problematic parts of ourselves or the things that we judge, like, we begin to realize, no, who I am is the person that has taken this journey and has given their best, and has, you know, maybe won some and lost some, but, like, the heart of me, the soul of me has, you know, done the best that I could to, say yes to life and go for it. And where I was still blocked or wasn't able to, there's legitimate reasons, and maybe we end up finding our way beyond them in this lifetime, or maybe it's another lifetime. But you know, the self love is really what makes it all so much easier, right?
Yeah.
To me, the guide, talks about first stage and second stage of the work, and I think my understanding, is like, I struggled and suffered a whole lot more before I was able to heal that self split. And now, I mean, it's never ever perfectly healed, but it's like, it's much more conscious, much more easily worked with, and often, is no issue at all, because there's been a mending and a reparation of my unification with all of my parts. and in a way that where I used to be so frustrated with myself and so I hated myself and I just wanted to you know somehow beat my problems out of myself and somehow be different and somehow be out of pain, and I was like causing most of that pain that I was in by the struggle, and the rejection of myself in that pain and the blaming of myself for that pain. And when we turn against ourselves like that, it's a lot of suffering. So thank goodness there's like even with not receiving it as children and having all of this distortion and confusion, I'm living testimony that we can find a way to return to self-love and restore that wholeness in that split, because I think I had one of the strongest ones. I mean, I was literally activated in bulimia and all kinds of stuff. So and I came out of a deep unconscious mental illness into you know this kind of clarity and light. So
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah, when it manifests in physically like that, you are deep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was young, and I mean I had yeah. And again, in other cultures, like I think people would recognize a child that went through something like that, as a child who was destined in a way, for shamanism, or kind of a help for the larger community, right? In our culture we don't recognize it. We just think that there's a problem, right? And everybody worries and everybody tries to control us and make it better, and that's what we learn that we have to do as well.
Mm.
And so this, a lot of times I think the early struggles of the child, like if a child is born to a difficult situation, if it goes through some struggles physically or emotionally or whatever early on in life, most of the traditions that I've read about, that you read about, their leaders, their spiritual leaders, their shamans, often they were recognized as children because they, had these kinds of difficulties and these manifestations of, uh, you know, sort of what we would call mental illness, right? But when we recognize mental illness as just, like a more open soul, a more sensitive soul, right?
Mm.
Uh, part of what I discovered was a lot of the bulimia that I had, was like was really an unconscious way that my body was using to help me clear myself of the energies that I didn't know I was internalizing and picking up because it was unconscious. But as I, discovered this and learned that that's what I was doing and learned how to not do that unconsciously, now I can use it as, when I want to help, like possibly, it's like I can use it, to really understand deeply where people are, but I can also use it, to like sometimes clear space for, other people, because I can feel, like energies that are coming into me, and and then I feel them kind of going through, and so I'm, oftentimes the other person burps and feels better. Okay.
Mm.
So there's ways, that again our suffering and everything that happens to us ultimately, is there as part of the education and the you know learning that we're doing. And the more we can become more conscious of what this is all about, I think it will help, because then parents can be more conscious with their children and that kind of stuff. But yeah, we came in, in just over the last, 75 years, like the consciousness of humanity has vastly expanded.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
and then we have our backlashes and all of
Yeah,
that. But
yeah, we're in a back pedal at the moment.
so, anything else? I think we got a little ways more to finish this lecture. So, yeah, but this inner split is like a huge thing, and again, if we don't recognize it inside, we're going to project it out, and we're going to, have it be outside of us. So we're going to work with it. But again, it's another way of working with it. But ultimately, to really resolve it, we have to see and come back into connection with ourselves deeply. So, it says consciousness must eventually lead to acceptance of what has previously been denied. If there is no mutuality between you and all the aspects of yourself, because your standards, your demands, and your expectations of yourself are unrealistic, it is absolutely unthinkable that mutuality between you and others can ever exist. I think this word unrealistic, our expectations of ourselves, they're unrealistic in the moment. I think that was a part of my problem, was that I came in some ways knowing that I had great potential. And so I had, this sense of my potential, and I wanted to manifest it. And there was an expectation of myself, and it was unrealistic in that moment, with all that I was dealing with and the wounding and stuff like that. But the expectation itself wasn't unrealistic. It was really the call for me to, work really hard and really long until, again, that Saturnian aspect, that, disciplined, egoic aspect that just has devotion and stick to itiveness, and, you know, can transcend the frustration and just keep doing the work. So, it's really, not that we can't expect from ourselves much more. It's not that's not what's unrealistic. Mutuality between you and yourself is absent when you reject the evil within you. Rejecting evil, you ignore and deny the vital, original, creative energy that is contained in all evil. So this is important here, and that word evil is strong, but it's like it really is part of what happens, is that, we see our faults and our flaws, and then we hate ourselves for them, or we're frustrated with ourselves, or we don't really want that. We want something else, but we can't stop, from doing that, or whatever. So, when we reject evil, we ignore and deny the vital, organic, creative energy that is contained in all evil. Like, evil is live spelled backwards, right? Is one of the ways that I kind of play with this, right? That everything that is in distortion is an original divine creative aspect. And so we can't just get rid of something. We have to reconvert it back into its original divine energy. This energy must be made available to you in order to become whole. The energy can only be transformed when you are aware of its distorted form. Yet when you reject its present manifestation, how can you reconvert it? So this has been what we've struggled, we've wanted to change ourselves, but we've wanted to change ourselves from the place of rejecting ourselves. And it can't be done. And that's why this work of integrating it all, can make this difference. And it's, when we're aware of its distorted, like, we can only transform it when we, are aware of it, and understand its distorted form. And so again, we have to just go in and feel and be with it, and recognize it, and allow it to be, and understand it deeply. And yet when you are rejecting any present manifestation, how can, we kind of receive it? So partly in this focusing stuff, we recognize that there's a part of us that's in a conflict with and will reject, but then we're going to awaken this other part that can see both of those parts and work with both of them. And that part is more the higher self. It's more this objective, compassionate observer, and that part is integrating and acknowledging all of these other parts of us, as he's talking about here. So no matter how evil and unacceptable any specific trait in you may be, no matter how undesirable and destructive, the energy and substance they consist of is a vital force without which you cannot fully function. Only as a whole person can you sustain pleasure. Only as a fully conscious person can you be whole. Only then can you not block the expansive movement and let your soul flow out into the universe of another entity, while remaining open to receive the other's outflowing energy currents and soul movements. Your disunity with yourself cannot bring unity with others. It is utter folly to expect it. You do not have to wait to become totally unified first, however. If you take your ongoing relationships and use them as yardsticks by which you gauge where your inner split is and where you stand in your willingness to accept the negative in you, you will grow into greater self-acceptance. Simultaneously, your ability to have mutuality will grow in proportion to your self-acceptance. Hence, your relationship will improve and become much more deeply meaningful. The acceptance of whatever in you has been rejected because you refuse to become conscious of it will immediately produce a greater acceptance and understanding of other people you have had to deal with. Mutuality will then become possible. By the same token, if you cannot accept the evil in you, thinking in effect, I must first be perfect before I can accept, love, trust, esteem myself, you must express an identical attitude toward the other person. When the reality dawns on you that he or she is far from perfect, you reject the other person, just as you keep rejecting your own self. The difference is that you manage most of the time to not know what you are doing with yourself. This is very unfortunate. You manage not to see this rejection of the imperfect self of the other for what it is. There are always handy explanations destined to get you away from seeing how you reject the unpalpable reality of yourself and others, and how this causes a rift in you that makes mutuality and bliss impossible. All of you can use what I say here as a very practical and immediate key in your inner work. You can look at all your relationships with family, partners, associates, friends, and business acquaintances. Look at any life situation where you may be involved with others. Look closely at those relationships if anything troubles you about them. To what degree are you truly open to the reality of the other person? If you honestly answer this question and can see that you are not open, you can use this key for yourself. Of course, you can easily shirk seeing it by busying yourself with your explanations, justifications, rationalizations, and even with your acute self-blame, which may easily be confused with self-acceptance, but is just as far removed from it as is overt self-denial. You know perfectly well in your mind that you and others are far from being perfect, and you pay lip service to this truth, but you do not really accept it in your heart of hearts. When you attempt to answer this question on the deeper emotional levels, you will see that in many instances the willingness is very small. Your reactions prove contrary to what you know in your mind. As you slowly discover your intolerance, your criticalness, your refusal to accept others for what they are, you automatically know that you do exactly the same with yourself. And I really feel like it's kind of, it's very useful to work on the other side of that scale and then, discover that, you see others, And sometimes when we've accepted ourselves, we can, I'm speaking from my own experience, get more critical of others. Um, but I think that criticalness has like a deeper consciousness behind it. And, it's like a discernment. And then if I can, recognize and you know, pull back on, the judgments part of it. It's like it can become useful. It's more discernment and more awareness and more consciousness. So now it is indeed difficult to accept the projected, acted out negativity of others, which always involves the use of a defense. that is more destructive than whatever they defend against in themselves. Your inability to cope with this acted out destructive behavior of others towards you again reflects your lack of awareness of when and how you are doing the same thing, though perhaps in a different way. It is easier to first see your reactions against others. If you can use those reactions as indicators, it will be much easier for you to discover what you are doing to yourself. So he's suggesting the other way around, and that makes sense too. The harm you inflict upon yourself by the negation of the acceptable part causes you to do precisely what I mentioned before. It makes you use subterfuges destined to cover up the unacceptable. And yet these subterfuges are more unacceptable than whatever you originally negated. And thus you compound your self-hate and widen the rift. If you are in shallow, unsatisfactory relationships which lack depth, gratification, and intimacy, where you reveal yourself only superficially, perhaps only revealing your idealized self-image, which you think is the only acceptable part of you, again, you will have a good gauge of where you are within yourself. You are not even taking a chance because you are unable to accept yourself. Hence, you cannot believe that your true, genuine self can ever be accepted, nor can you accept others for where they are in their present state of development. All this excludes mutuality. The moment of opening up and taking in the relaxed bliss of streaming into another energy field and accepting the emanation of the other energy field. This bliss is unbearable and appears dangerous for those who hate themselves. When you contract after every temporary opening, you can realize this does not happen because you are evil and do not deserve the bliss, but because you cannot accept the totality of forces and energies as they exist in you now. So like if we could really acknowledge and accept the totality of all of the forces and energies in us as they exist in us now, and we didn't judge and critique ourselves and reject ourselves, then we would be able to feel the goodness of life, right? Opening to, it's always here, it's always present. We're just like disconnected from it because we can't really receive it. We don't feel we deserve it. And therefore you remain locked in the contradictions and cannot convert them into expansions. So the principle of mutuality must first be applied to the relationships between you and your inner self. Only then can it be extended to your relationships with others. And that's what I would say. But I guess he's saying that you can see, what we're doing in relationship to others to reflect back on our relationship with ourselves. So let me say here, my friends, from the vantage point of a higher degree of consciousness, that all the separateness that appears so real in your realm is as much an illusion as the separateness between your own two selves. It is an artifact that comes into being exclusively because of what is denied. By closing your eyes and your consciousness to the total person you happen to be at this stage, you create these apparently two selves, the acceptable and the unacceptable. But in reality, they are not two entities. They are both you, whether or not you choose to know this now. But are you really two people? Of course not. The same illusion prevails about all apparently separate entities. Here too the separation is an arbitrary, artificial construct of the mind, as it were. In reality, such a division does not exist. This may not be easy for you to feel at this stage, but the fact remains that human beings live in this overall illusion of separateness, which is the cause of pain and struggle. In reality, all is one, and every entity is connected with everything else in the universe. And this is not merely a figure of speech. One consciousness permeates the universe and everything therein. But you can begin to experience this unity only when there is no longer any part of yourself that is excluded, denied, or split off. So there's some Q&As. I don't know, not too many, so I guess we can continue. We got a little time, see if they're connected. Any comments or questions on the end of the lecture there? I think it's really a useful, way to explore. So question, can you discuss the aspect of mutuality on the physical, mental, and spiritual levels from the energetic point of view? Yes, from the energetic point of view, the expanding movement is an outgoing and outflowing movement. When two separate human beings open up toward one another in mutuality, able to accept an open flow without contracting, right? Like you can even do this, experience, maybe, I don't know, on Zoom, but we used to do it in-person TP where, we would just be across from each other, and trying to, both, be present and sort of sending and also receiving the other person, making eye contact, that kind of thing, and it's very difficult sometimes, it's like we feel very, open, vulnerable, exposed, and to accept an open flow without contracting from somebody else, and the energy from one interpenetrates the energy field of the other, and vice versa. It's a constant interflow and exchange. It is otherwise with the people who remain separate, who contract and cannot open up to mutuality. Two such people remain enclosed, each like an island, with little or no energy being exchanged. And when exchange of energy is blocked, the great evolutionary plan is delayed. In the case where a person can open only when there is no chance of mutuality, or when a yes current must be met with a no current because mutuality still seems too frightening. One energy flow streams out, but reverberates and bounces back, thrown back by the closed energy field of the other. The latter is like a wall that throws off any incoming flow. And, you may be aware of, like, oh, and that's also what's happening. It seems like, when you try to connect, that they're not receiving you, that they, are bouncing you back. So thus the two flows can never become one flow. This phenomenon can easily be observed in the everyday life of people. They either always fall in love when it is not reciprocated, or for apparently unfathomable reasons, they fall out of love when their partner has deep feelings. To a more subtle degree, the same principle exists in ongoing relationships. When one person is open, the other is closed, and vice versa. Only steady development and growth changes this, so that both learn to remain open to one another. On the spiritual and emotional levels, the lowest stage indicates an acute state of fear. The fear of accepting the self in its present stage is essentially the same fear that wants to run away from true mutuality and bliss. Since the fear is there, hate must also come into being with all its derivatives. The mental levels are affected by this process of avoidance when a person seeks ready explanations for what cannot be understood unless the self is accepted for what it is now. So, we look at all of the other things that it's causing, and it's kind of like this one that's so close that we don't see it, and the self-rejection and the self-split is sort of the foundation and has to be worked with first. The mental activity becomes so busy that it cannot attune to the higher voices within the self, right? We're trying to figure it out and fix it, and we're in pain, and we're desperate, and, so it's like, it's hard to tune into the higher self voices when we're in that kind of contraction and suffering and fear. So more separation is thus engendered. Mental noise creates more disconnection from the feelings and from the state that first created this condition. Such a person or entity is forced by its own choice to live in a constant state of frustration and unfulfillment. Physically, this creates, of course, all the blocks in the body, which you already know so well. In the second stage, where alternate opening up and contracting occurs, the mental activity of the person is confused. Searching and groping cannot yield truthful answers as long as the self is not accepted with its very worst. Mental confusion creates more frustration and anger. The faulty interpretations, which are supposed to explain why the person is always missing mutuality, only increase frustration and therefore anger and hate. On the emotional level, longing and disappointment alternate with fulfillment and fantasy. This indicates some degree of opening and flow, although without real mutuality. Withdrawal and contraction also include anger and hate, disappointment and blaming. When self-acceptance makes mutuality possible and energy is exchanged, the universal movements flow evenly. The healthy alternating of the expanding, contracting, and static principles prevail where individuals find themselves in the eternal rhythm, harmonious with the universe. So be blessed, my dearest ones. May this lecture again be like a little light going on inside yourself, giving you hope and strength, showing you from yet another side the way and leading you more strongly toward accepting yourself exactly as you are now. May you not indulge in anything nor excuse it, but see it for what it is. Accept the imperfection fully, neither embellishing it nor exaggerating it so that you cringe with shame and fear. All these distortions must disappear, for they are pitfalls, much more disastrous than whatever aspects you hate yourself for. When you find and apply this attitude, you will find your happiness and the truth that unites you with yourself and the universe. Okay, stopping the share. So, strong, big, deep lecture. It actually, there's a second part to it, that even is where the guide talks about receiving the force, and sometimes we need this help of spirit in these deep places of, our negativity and our difficulty. So, this is a deep, strong lecture. I'm sure if I read it every day, I'd get something new out of it and a deeper level of understanding with it. But hopefully, again, I wasn't expecting it. I don't read these lectures in advance. I just, let's do this one. I kind of read the beginning of it to see if there's nothing too difficult with it or something. But, it's like, it I wasn't expecting, like this kind of mutuality with self to be in this lecture. And that is my direct experience in this work, that this is what is we're all working to develop now. And that mutuality will then expand and, to, all of life and this deeper joy of being able to say yes. Any last comments?
Thank you, Darlene.
Okay. Have a good evening.
You too.